The Bird Emergency, the podcast about threatened, endangered birds and the people who are trying to do something tangible to save them. Today, I'm speaking with, someone's dinging you in the background. Hopefully that was someone buying the film, with Scott Mouat. Now, I've pronounced Mouat right, haven't I, Scott? A good Scottish.
You have. You've done well. I'm impressed, mate. I'm impressed.
Well, there's plenty of Mouats in this part of the world, here in Victoria, in Australia. Now, Scott's a filmmaker, and that's a title that is all-encompassing. He's a guy who stands behind the camera, gets the sound level right, drags a tripod to wherever it's got to go, set up the hide, and deal with the suits. You got to deal with the suits. Now, Scott's made
and gets all the blame at the end if none of that.
Exactly right. Now, why am I talking to a filmmaker in a podcast about rare and threatened birds? Well, Scott's in New Zealand, and New Zealand's got one of the most endearing, weirdo, but extremely endangered parrots, and that is the Kakapo. Have I got that right?
Close. It's a tricky one. Kakapo.
Kakapo. There we are. See, my Maori is shocking, but we'll just press on with it. Now, Scott, you've just made your second film on this amazing bird, and many people will have only come across what a character this bird is from having watched, I think it was the BBC series, certainly British series, Last Chance to See. And many people will have seen a parrot trying to fornicate somebody's head. So that was an absolute beauty. Scott, can you tell us a bit about why you're so into this bird, and tell us about the first film you've made, and then we'll go on with your new one.
Cool. Yeah, I guess the first film I made was the Unnatural History of the Kakapo, and that was pretty much the first big project that I got involved with after I went to University of Otago and did the postgraduate diploma in natural history filmmaking there. While I was doing that, I stumbled on this slightly unbelievable story of the conservation work that was going into this strange parrot that lived on our offshore islands. At the time when I started making that first film, it was, when did I start making that? 2006. Then there was a population of about, if I remember right, about 74, 75 birds in total. That was it for the kakapo. And the parrot itself, it's essentially a giant budgie. That's the best way to describe it. Anybody who doesn't know it, imagine your budgie enlarged by about 10 or 15 times, and there you've got a kakapo. They're often described as the world's strangest parrot, not just because they enjoy fornicating with Englishmen's heads, but because they're nocturnal. They're a black breeding species, which means they have a breeding arena, I think a bit like your bowerbirds over there. And they are completely flightless, like several of New Zealand's bird species. So yeah, that sets them aside on their own. They're one of three parrot species we've got over here, the ka, which is our standard issue parrot, if you like, that lives in the forest, even though they're also endangered. We've got the kia that lives up in the mountains, and then we've got the kakapo that lives in the forest but only comes out at night. So they're our main parrot species over here. And the kakapo, being critically endangered, was obviously a good subject, I thought, for a film. And the main thing that hooked me into that first film was the fact that they were trying, how do we add to there's a lot of, how would you describe it, work that goes into the sexual behavior of this parrot. So one of the big problems they have with them is infertility, and one of the ways they try and get around that is by using artificial insemination. So essentially that was what caught my interest on this first film. That was the crux of it. They were trying this new artificial insemination process to make more kakapo, because the kakapo simply weren't doing a good enough job. That was the crux of the first film, which is on YouTube and Vimeo. It's readily available if anybody wants to watch it. And it was a good introduction to the kakapo and the people that work with it. Interestingly, I think New Zealand, we've got interesting species. They're interesting scientifically. They're not up there with lions and tigers when it comes to your normal television viewing. I think most people would probably be more drawn to watch a lion running down a wildebeest than a kakapo climbing a tree. But the science behind it and the people behind it are one of the things that interested me most, the characters and I guess the level of work that goes into increasing numbers of this critically endangered bird.
Now, one of the characters working with the bird, I'm guessing you're talking about Andrew Digby.
So Andrew wasn't working on that first film, but yeah, on the latest film, Andrew has featured significantly. So essentially what happened on the latest film, I finished the first film in 10. And so we're 10 years on. And last year, the Kakapo had their biggest breeding season ever. So we had it's called a megamast in New Zealand. It's essentially a 1 in 15 or 20 year event where the trees and grasses produce this profusion of fruit and seeds. And it's this profusion that a lot of species within that ecosystem rely on to raise large families. And the Kakapo's no different. It's solely reliant on that. In fact, when you look back over if you look back over the history of Kakapo recovery, and Andrew will be able to tell you more on this, I think there's 2003 and 2019 are the only years that if the Kakapo had been left to their own devices, that they would have successfully raised chicks. The rest of the time, it's unlikely that they would have produced any offspring without the help of humans. So what it looks like is that they've just got this, we've always known they've had a very slow reproductive cycle. Generally, it's thought every 3 or 4, 5 years. But now it's looking more like that it's a 1 in 15, 1 in 20 year event that they rely on to increase their numbers.
So that begs the question, with such a long breeding cycle intermission, that the birds have got to be quite long-lived.
Yeah, so the Kakapos, they estimate the Kakapo lives till its 90s, maybe older. So when you think that pre-human New Zealand, there would have been very little around that would have preyed on Kakapo. So they can do things slowly. They can do things big once every 15 or 20 years. And in pre-human New Zealand, that was enough to make them one of the commonest birds in the country.
So how rapid was the decline that you're aware of? And was it mainly introduced feral animals that was responsible for that?
Yeah, so there would have been a decline when Maori arrived, not to the extent perhaps that there would have been with Moa from the fossil records, but certainly a decline of some sort. But the main decline happened post-European arrival. So there's a lot of records around about the mid-18th century where Kakapo were still reasonably common, certainly in the mountains in the Southern Alps on the west coast and in Fiordland. But what happened around about the 1860s, 1870s, our farmers, Europeans had brought a lot of introduced species over: goats, pigs, deer, rabbits, and unfortunately rats, mice. What they introduced them to was an environment where there was no natural predators for them. So you had all these prey species, especially rabbits, with no predators, and rabbits did what rabbits do. And there was plagues of rabbits across the South Island. I imagine the North Island, they had such an impact that they were actually killing a lot of the grass, to the extent that the farmers and the sheep were unable to survive. So remembering that we're in the 1860s, 1870s, the best way that they figured to balance this whole situation was to introduce stoats, ferrets, and weasels, which they did. And stoats, ferrets, and weasels did pretty good on the rabbits and the other bits and pieces. But after a while, they found other things to eat. And so from, I would say, probably 1880 on, you can read in the records of the steady decline of New Zealand's, especially our flightless species.
We're lucky here in Australia that we got the fox, but we didn't get those others, which probably would have been a total disaster here. And we were no stranger to rabbit plagues here, one of the most misguided introductions probably anywhere in the world. But we didn't get the stoats and the weasels and the ferrets. Are they still present in the environment in New Zealand?
They're prolific. They're everywhere. From our eco-sanctuaries, which are essentially our fenced wildlife reserves. And in New Zealand, the only way that we can protect native areas of forest is to put a very expensive and very technical fence around them. In some areas, for example, the Aoteoroa, which is a forest reserve on North Island, has 27 kilometres of predator-proof fence around it. And that fence is to keep out possums, ferrets, stoats, weasels, cats, rats, mice, as well as obviously looking after our native species, which is good for our flightless species because it keeps them obviously in, they can't get out. But we've also got species that are poor flyers, which means they spend most of the time hopping around on or near the ground. They can fly well enough to get over the fence, but they're still incredibly vulnerable to introduce predators. And one of the biggest problems, it's not just that they feed on the ground, it's their behaviors of nesting and essentially living on or close to the ground. And certainly with Kakapo, one of the biggest issues with them, the Kakapo is a very distinctive smell. When they raise their chicks are in the nest for 2 to 3 months. So again, by the time that you've been in a hole in the ground, in the same hole in the ground, you were pretty smelly to start. After 2 months, it's a very obvious little bit of accommodation that they've got, especially to anything that's got a good sense of smell. And unfortunately, most of the introduced mammals that came to New Zealand have exactly that, a very good sense of smell.
Small population base in New Zealand, so it's probably imaginable because of the economics of it to do any sort of real control on either of the main islands in New Zealand. So I guess you're stuck with small fenced off areas or working on offshore island and eradicating the pest species, the feral predators there. Is that the approach that's happening now?
That's the current reality, is that the only place that we can have a natural New Zealand environment, really semi-natural because we've lost a lot of species anyway, but as natural a pre-human New Zealand environment as we can get these days is on our offshore islands. The ones that are, and we have to be careful with our offshore islands as well, because stoats and rats especially, they are very capable swimmers, and 2 or 3 kilometers is actually not too much for a rat or a stoat to accomplish. So we have some very special offshore islands, and realistically, at the moment, those are the only places that we can find a pre-human, what would be similar to a pre-human wild New Zealand environment. That said, the government, and I'd say New Zealand as a whole, has a very ambitious goal, which is being pushed at the moment, which is a predator-free 2050. So that goal is to rid New Zealand entirely of stoats, ferrets, and I can't remember, there's 3 species, but that's, again, a very ambitious project and will take quite a bit of technical and scientific thinking to find a way to achieve that. But that is a goal that New Zealand has at the moment. How achievable that is or not, obviously we have conquered COVID, so there's no reason that perhaps we can't get rid of stoats and ferrets as well.
Weasels and brush-tailed possums.
The Australians.
Yeah. Well, I think you guys pioneered the possum pie, didn't you?
It's interesting. There is markets out there. I've heard mixed reports as to how tasty possum is. There are industries in the byproducts of the killing of introduced pest species. Exactly how big those markets are, I'm not too sure. Yeah.
So we're not going to see Mouat's pies with the possum pie and the weasel delight anytime soon.
I wouldn't discount it, but not at this stage.
Scott, just on those pest species, ferrets are a very popular pet in many countries. So they're not super popular here in Australia, but people have still got them. With that aim to have a sort of pest-free New Zealand by 2050, has the government taken the steps of saying that you can't have stoats, weasels, ferrets as pets?
Well, that's I guess a bigger conversation that the country will have near the time when if it becomes a reality, because it's not just ferrets. Ferrets are not wide kept as pets over here. There are people that use ferrets, certainly over in central Otago, to control rabbits. But you've got to remember that even though they're pest species, like the stoats, the weasels, the ferrets, their main prey is still rats and mice. Rats and mice on their own do a lot of damage when they're in plague proportions. So there's the question of what happens once you've knocked out the stoats and the weasels and there's nothing left to control the rats and mice. Do you just create yourself another problem that you then need to solve that's potentially bigger than the first problem? And the other issue is obviously cats. We have a big problem over here with feral cats as well. Everybody knows where feral cats start from, and they're simply discarded domestic cats. So where do we stand with getting rid of our domestic cats? We're never going to see Kakapo in somebody's back garden while they've got a cat sitting on their fence.
Oh, that's one of the major challenges here as well. Cats are. Look, I don't think the community at large likes to face the reality of how much damage cats do. And birds are the obvious prey that we talk about, but lizards, small reptiles, amphibians, they're just marauders. And yeah, that's obviously something that island nations such as ourselves have got big issues with.
Yep, and it's the same over here. My films concentrate on the bird species. I'll have to do it. My next film will be about our lizard species, just to resurrect that balance. But yeah, skinks, geckos, we've got a lot of endemic species outside of birds, which are hard hit by stoats, rats, ferrets, cats. Yeah, so it's not just a flightless bird problem.
Tell us about making a film about an extremely rare bird and a bird that lives in the mountains and New Zealand, as we know, for a large part of the year is pretty cold compared to an awful lot of the world.
It's getting warmer, though.
Cool.
Yeah. So the latest film that I've done tells two stories. Well, the biggest story for the new film is essentially one of rewilding New Zealand's native areas. Does that by telling two stories. One of the Kakapo, which lives on our offshore islands and is critically endangered. It has three breeding populations on offshore islands, but their population is on the up, and you would consider them as being a wild species. The other side of the story, or the other story that is woven into the film, is one of the Takahe. So the Takahe is what would look like a swamp hen. You have swamp hens? Like
we do have. We have the some people call it the purple swamp hen, the eastern swamp hen, about as big as a leghorn chicken.
Yep. So that would be similar to our keko, which we have over here, which is essentially one of your purple swan hen. The Pakeko arrived a few thousand years ago, wind blown from the Pacific Islands or Australia, set up home here, and they can still fly and they can walk around. But a few hundred years prior to that, the ancestors of the Pakeko and the Takahe and the purple swan hen were also blown over here. And over time, in New Zealand, they became giants, which are now Takahe. So these are 4 kilogram swamp hens, essentially, that just graze on tussock. Pre-human, again, they would have been across New Zealand. There was a South Island subspecies, there was a North Island subspecies. Anywhere where you found grassland or tussock grassland, you would have found a pair of Takahe. Again, the arrival of Maori, they were easy food, and arrival of Europeans with cats and ferrets, easy pickings. So by the end of the 20th century, so the late 1900s, fewer and fewer sightings of Takahe were turning up, and it was a bit of a mythical beast, and there was a big effort in the 1890s to actually find them and prove that they existed, which nobody managed to do. All they found was 4 carcasses. So I think in 1897 they were declared extinct. They remained that way for about 50 years until 1948. A man called Geoffrey Orbell, who was a doctor down in Invercargill, had for years had a passion and a belief that the Takahe still existed somewhere. He had done a bit of detective work, went up into the Murchison Mountains, which are the foothills of Fiordland, which is our most rugged area down in the southwest corner of the South Island. And up there in this he found this lost world in this valley and found a number of Takahe wandering around. So that was essentially what he'd found, was the last wild population of Takahe living in the Murchison Mountains and Fjord. Up until 2 or 3 years ago, that was still the only wild population of Takahe that existed. What the mountains provided was this, I guess it was the very edge of their habitat that they could happily survive in. It wasn't an easy life for them. We're talking an area that in winter is blanketed by a metre of snow, where the lakes are all frozen over and where your average temperature would be in the minuses. Somehow these birds managed to survive it. Probably because it was also, even though it's difficult for them, it was possible to survive, but it was also difficult for all these introduced pests to survive there as well. So they managed, it's the wrong word, but it was obviously this zone of existence that they could occupy between it being too harsh and too difficult and certain death and too many predators and good country. There was an area in the middle. So that was their last wild population. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I got word that the Department of Conservation had another objective, which was establishing a second wild population for them. With Takahe, that's difficult because unlike Kakapo, a Takahe pair needs, I think, 5 hectares roughly of grassland to survive in. All they do all day, every day is eat grass because of the low nutrient value of tussock. They need to eat constantly. So they need these huge grasslands in order to survive. None of our offshore islands, none of our eco sanctuaries provide enough habitat that you can have several pairs existing together in what could become a sustainable population. So yeah, it's taken a long time and a lot of work for the guys to find other areas around New Zealand that could potentially sustain another wild population. And that's something, so that's another area of the film that we followed. So that's the Takahe. And they and Kakapo would once have lived together in that same area of Fiordland. But again, they followed 2 slightly different conservation paths. The other interesting thing with the Takahe is they were critically endangered up till about 2 years ago. I think now I could be wrong on this, but they're now endangered. They've dropped down a threat level. Even though their wild population is still roughly the same as kakapo, Takahe do actually do very well in eco-sanctuaries. So in our fenced sanctuaries around the country, you can have a pair of Takahe, and with a little bit of extra food in terms of they have a food pellet, like a special feed, which they're fed in little bowls. They can do reasonably well. They can reproduce. So even though this wild population is still struggling, these birds in eco-sanctuaries are reproducing. So the number of the species as a whole is increasing.
Is there a lot of work on their genetics, and are they individuals being swapped around to maintain genetic diversity?
So it's the other interesting thing with the kakapo especially, and Andrew will go into a heap of detail on this because he loves the whole genetic side of things. He's a scientist. He'll give you lots of figures and graphs and charts and stuff. But yeah, they're essentially, it's like a pedigree. It's like a dog breeding program. So with the kakapo especially, they have now mapped the kakapo's genome. So they know the genetic makeup of every single kakapo that exists, and they know who he's related to. So they can essentially control the breeding program and help match up the best females with the best males by putting match birds on islands together. Takahe, they're just getting started into a more detailed look at their DNA and their genes. They're not as bad as kakapo, so that they weren't quite as genetically bereft as the kakapo were. That single wild population still had a reasonable amount of genetic diversity in it. So the Takahe has never had, although they still have infertility problems, they've not had the level of infertility issues that the kakapo have had.
What's the sort of next step for let's talk about the Takahe. Will it continue to be, do you think, just a managed population at a sort of just sustainable level, or is there a desire within New Zealand more generally to increase the amount of habitat which is available to to both species? They've both got similar challenges as being ground living and whatnot. So do you think there's going to be more areas that are fenced off, that are excluded from the predators?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there is that general desire within New Zealand that they want to see native wildlife flourishing. And that includes, obviously, everybody. You're not going to find anybody that wouldn't want a kakapo in their back garden. That would be the dream. But at the moment, I think people would also like to see more of our more common native birds, tuis, bellbirds, fantails, just our usual garden fare. Would be nice to just do better, but it's a struggle. The one thing I'm lucky, I guess, that I've filmed on some of these offshore islands. And once an area of land has been cleared of predators and is left to the native species, it takes a few years, but once it comes back, it's an incredible thing to experience. It is, when we were down filming on Codfish Island, I literally couldn't point the camera in a direction without getting a bird of some description in the frame. It made my job quite a bit easier than it normally is. It's not unusual for us here. You go through a walk in a normal scenic reserve, so not a fenced eco-sanctuary, not an offshore island. You'll come across a few of your more common birds, but that's it. You can't deny that our wildlife over here as a whole has been absolutely hammered. And I don't think anybody would want to see that recovering. It's just, there's going to be a balance of the level that can recover to matched against what we're willing to sacrifice economically to make that happen.
Do you think it's possible that New Zealand could be the first country to only allow cats that are indoor or only in runs?
I would like that to be the case, not being a cat person.
The uniqueness of the flora and fauna of New Zealand. We have a similar situation here, but the situation in New Zealand is even far more specialised, and the number of species is far less. Does the success of the areas that have been rewilded, for want of a better term, repaired, managed, if we sort of use all of those terms a bit interchangeably when we talk about those island sanctuaries, when people experience the sort of almost original New Zealand, does that motivate them more to do more in the urban areas?
Absolutely. I think with the Kakapo Recovery Program, most of the film I made was based on an island called Whenua. It sits about 30 kilometres south of the south coast of our South Island. One, I think, of the best conservation ideas that they have there is the volunteers. So you can volunteer and you can spend a week, 2 weeks on Codfish Island, running the feed-out line, so filling the hoppers, looking after the bird food, doing general duties. They bring people in from their sponsors, like the Meridian, I think, is now the main sponsor for the Kakapo. So Meridian is a New Zealand energy company. So they're one of the main sponsors for the Kakapo program. And in the past, the sponsors have sent volunteers to the island to experience that. So you get people coming from all walks of life who wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as green or conservationists. And I think 99% of them would agree that they were changed by the time they spent on those islands. When you've spent 2 weeks in a pristine forest and you fly back to the New Zealand mainland, and as you're flying into the airfield or the heli landing site, you're looking at fields and fields of farmland and not much in the way of native forest, you do ask yourself whether there's work that still needs to be done in redressing the balance, a natural, healthy balance for the environment.
So what's your sense of the future for the Kakapo and the Takahe?
So the Takahe, I think the Takahe is, I wouldn't say it's easier, but they're certainly facing different issues. In many ways, the Kakapo is now in the position that the Takahe was 2 or 3 years ago, and that their populations are at the level now where they need to find new islands for them. So for me, one of the most promising things I think on the horizon for us in terms of conservation and rewilding New Zealand's native landscape is the work that's being done on Stewart Island. So Stewart Island's our third biggest island. It sits, again, just off the south coast of New Zealand. And there's a plan and a feasibility study which has just begun into how easy it would be to get rid of introduced species on. And compared to Codfish Island, Stewart Island's massive. But the advantage is that Stewart ferrets and weasels were never introduced to Stewart Island. So the main problem that Stewart Island has is one of rats, possums, and feral cats. So feral cats are the biggest issue, certainly for Kakapo on Stewart Island. Realistically speaking, I think it's a lot more realistic to think that we can achieve a predator-free Stewart Island than an entire predator-free New Zealand. And Stewart Island would be an incredible asset. It would be a remarkable tourist attraction. When you see what Codfish Island is like, take that, multiply it by 1,000 and put that on Stewart Island, it would be absolutely phenomenal. To me, that should be our next step. If we can achieve that, then we can probably look at clearing South Island. If we can clear South Island, we can look at clearing North Island. But you've got to remember that maybe 60-70% of our main islands are farmland. Why do we want predator-free farms?
Yeah, then all the issues that we've got here about corridors and whatnot come into play. So there's a whole lot of wider management issues that need to be addressed. Now, Stewart Island, does it have much standing forest remaining on?
Yep. So Stewart Island areas have been forest, but there's still a huge amount of forest available there. The whole southern end of the island is relatively untouched. Yeah. So it's an incredible asset. And if that was, as I say, predator-free, it would be a phenomenal eco-sanctuary. And
sounds like the volunteer program could be used to, not as a program for tourism, but if you could promote tourism that was able to change the attitudes towards some of our domestic pets, that might sort of help shift the needle just a little bit more. But tourism in areas that are remnant and pristine is often a dangerous proposition. What's your view about sort of ramping up tourism to Stewart Island in particular?
Yeah, I think Stewart Island that's what it would be all geared towards. It would essentially be islands up until, and I think it's a reasonably recent thing. New Zealand's conservation thinking has been very much that you take your critically endangered, your most special species, you put them on a faraway island, you keep them safe, you keep their numbers going, and you do that by not letting people anywhere near them. And so that's where the Takahe are. It's a special scientific reserve, so you can only go up there with a permit if you've got work to do, apart from 1 or 2 days a year where they take an organised group up to walk through the mountains. Codfish Island, Whenua, you can only go there if you're a volunteer or doc working directly with the Kakapo. And the same with our other extra special offshore island sanctuaries like Aoteoroa, which is up in the North Island. That said, we do have a number of other islands where people can go to and people can walk around, and they are pest-free, and they're an incredible asset. So you've got these islands that are halfway, that they're open to the tourist, open to the public, so people can go there and people can see species like Takahe, saddleback, various threatened species in a natural environment. I guess it's just, we've got to be very careful over here because of, especially rats. We're talking about islands, we're talking about the main way that people are going to go there is on boats, and rats are very adept at hiding in little spaces and hiding on boats, and the last little swim to the island would be nothing for them after a taxi ride on a boat. So we've got to be pretty careful that we do have these islands that are kept secure, if you like. At the same time, we've got to ensure that New Zealand as a whole knows the value of these and knows how wonderful it is to have an introduced species you've got there in the background.
It is. There's one in my yard and there's one in the yard next door, and they're obviously communicating.
Yeah, so it's having islands that are secure and that are a safe haven for our native species is important. But at the same time, it's also incredibly important that we can show people, and that not so much for tourism, but well, for tourism is important for the income, but for New Zealanders as a whole, I think to be able to fully understand what a native New Zealand ecosystem is like is vital for our country, especially if we're looking at pushing forward and doing the work that's going to be required to get us predator-free by 2050.
Yeah, attitude adjustment. That's one of the great values of tourism. Now, that leads me back to your films, Scott, because I imagine that they're also a good way of educating people and maybe shifting the needle a bit on the way people feel about the effort and the money that it takes to preserve the natural environment in an island nation. Commercially making wildlife documentaries is really difficult, but do you get a payoff in the longer term? Like your first film, it's available online, but I'm assuming that you're able to do a run of cinema releases and community halls and things like that, which is how a lot of the nature documentaries that have been made in Australia have had a run. Did you go through that cycle?
Yeah, so with the first one, there was a limited cinema release around New Zealand with the festivals. It did the festival circuit, did reasonably well. I reversioned it for New Zealand television into a 1-hour slot, and that was played on one of our New Zealand preview channels. But I certainly didn't make a fortune from it. And I actually did an interesting experiment. I thought I'll put a version on YouTube and for free as a reasonably low quality version. I'll put a version on another streaming website, which was Vimeo, and charge people $5 or $10 for watching a high quality version. And we'll see what comes back from it. Interestingly, I think there's been 50 to 100 people have paid for and watched the Vimeo version, whereas we're close to 80,000 on YouTube for the first Kakapo film.
Well, I hope you've got ads top and tailing it so that you're at least getting some kind of revenue back.
Yeah, the monetized stuff's great. You sit there and you see 80,000 views and you think, I'll go and check my bank account because it's bound to be full.
$7.50.
There's 7 cents, I think, more or less. And you realize how many views you actually need to make money on these platforms. Yeah. You're talking in the millions. So I think I came away from the first Kakapo film saying that making a film without investment up front from a broadcaster was a foolish way to go, because the money that you get having made something yourself and then offering it for sale is a fraction of what you get in terms of a sale up front to a broadcaster before it's been made. So yeah, I swore I would never do that again, and then promptly did it again with the next one. But I approach broadcasters, but it's difficult over here. We have natural history shows are expensive. They take a lot of time to make and a lot of time in the field. When you have a small population, a small country like New Zealand, there's not a huge amount of funds available for the television that you would ideally like to make. And that's got to spread. That's got to be spread amongst a fair amount of production companies. I've been unable to get support from New Zealand broadcasters for my project for whatever reason. That said, I've never let it stop me making a film, especially when it comes to what was the Takahe's introduction. It's going to be the Takahe's introduction into a new Mouat site, which for the Takahe is probably one of the biggest events that's happened since its rediscovery in 1948. And as a conservation measure, would be something that effectively saves the species from extinction. Okay, so having one wild species of anything is a recipe for disaster. It's having all your, no pun intended, you've got all your eggs in one basket if you've just got one wild population. Anything goes wrong with that, you're screwed. For the Kakapo, they're now iconic species. Not everybody, most people around the world probably know what a Kakapo is, largely thanks to Mark Carwadine's head. You take whatever publicity you can get, and that was incredible publicity for the Kakapo Recovery Program. It was great. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's any easier to access funding. But again, what was happening last year was the biggest breeding season that the Kakapo Recovery Program had ever had, potentially doubling the number of Kakapo that they had. They didn't quite double it, but there was potential for that at the start of the season. To me, there's going to be a good amount of drama. There's going to be some great stories that are going to evolve. There's great science involved with it, and there's an unusual and fascinating species to wrap it all around. So to me, it would be great if I was a better salesman and I could sell these things up front to broadcasters. But I balance that out with it's important to tell the stories of these recovery programs and for people in general to see the work that's going into the Kakapo Recovery Program and the Takahe Recovery Program. We take it for granted, and I think Takahe is probably the best example because most people in New Zealand are probably an hour away from a pair of Takahe. You can go to almost any eco sanctuary and you'll see two fat Takahe wandering around with two fat fluffy chicks. And as soon as you see that, you think they're good. The Takahe is well looked after and it's well on the road to recovery, which unfortunately isn't the case because in the wild, they're still struggling. They're losing 10 to 15% of that wild population every year just through environmental factors. They live in an incredibly harsh environment and the weather's awful, so they drown. They're in avalanches, rock slides. 10% of the wild population are knocked out every year. And once every 5 or 6 years, you get these stoat plagues. You get a rat plague followed by a stoat plague. Stoats get a bad rap because they are predators and they do prey on Takahe and Kakapo. But their main prey source is rats and mice. That's what they prefer. Rabbits, top of their list. They love rabbit. They prefer rabbit, but they'll take rats and mice. So the problem that you have in the wild population is when those populations of rats and mice die out over a harsh winter, you're left with a large population of stoats that have nothing to eat. And that's when they turn on the native species. So yeah, I've completely lost my train of thought.
Is there any reintroduction happening of the Takahe into the wild environment, or are they all going into the fenced-off eco-sanctuaries?
So, no, yeah, so that's it's just difficult because people see them in those eco-sanctuaries. That's the problem, I think, that there's a misconception that they're doing well, when in the wild they are actually struggling. And that is a big point to the films that I make. People need to be made aware of that there's a story behind these creatures. So, and you have to watch the film and see what happens. But essentially, these birds that are raised in these eco-sanctuaries have to be retrained so that they can then be relocated back into the wild. So it's a huge and complex operation that goes into keeping 150, 200 birds alive in our mountains, and the birds that are up in the Murchison Mountains, nobody ever sees.
Yeah. So, yeah. Now, Scott, the first film is out there, and as you said, it's there on Vimeo, and it's there on, and of course you can give me the links for that, and we'll hope a lot more people see them. Hopefully a lot more people go to Vimeo and spend the money. But your latest film, how are you going in terms of securing a distributor or some form of release for that?
Teamed up with a production company up in Auckland that I've done a bit of work with in the past.
To stop you there, was that on what I believe is your most significant credit that I saw to date? Motorway Patrol. Love it.
Yeah, Motorway Patrol.
We love Motorway Patrol in this house. It's
funny.
You've done several series, so it must either be really good to be associated with it, or it pays pretty good.
A little bit of, Highway Patrol is, that's a fun little show. Yeah, to spend 10 hours a day sitting next to a highway patrolman hoping that he meets the worst customer he's ever had in his life. Yeah.
Come on, moron. Come on. Let's get another moron. Yeah. Look, I apologise for anyone who is in a country that doesn't get Motorway Patrol.
Sure, there are any countries that don't get Motorway Patrol anymore. Even when we're out filming now, you'll come across people from here, there and everywhere, and everybody is like, I've seen that show. I love that show.
Yeah, it's a nugget. Okay, we're back to conservation, Scott.
Not Motorway Patrol, but we did other shows called, it's a discovery show called Modern Dinosaurs, which was basically looking at conservation programs around New Zealand, and another one that followed that, which was Volcanic New Zealand. So again, they're two really interesting sciencey shows. But yeah, I was chatting to James, who runs that company, and he's put it to his distributor. So yeah, we've had some interest. I think it's sitting on Nat Geo's desk at the moment. It's taken a long time. I think people have probably been, even though we thought COVID-19 might be a good thing for selling television shows, I think because corporations and because businesses as a whole have been hit so hard, anyone who relies on advertising like Nat Geo, Discovery, everybody's been hit in some way and is suffering. So I think it's taking longer than we initially thought to secure a deal. But I'm an eternal optimist. I'm hopeful that something will come of it at some stage down the track.
It's BBC Wild. Why aren't the BBC Life Science or whatever their studio's called now, why aren't they on the phone to you?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they will be after this.
It's the kind of story that you'd reckon David Attenborough would love.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, interestingly, the last work I did with the Kakapo Recovery Program was we made a little 5-minute, 6-minute short film, which Deidre and Diggs when they were crossing Deidre is the manager for the Kakapo and Takahe recovery programs, and Andrew, who's the scientist. They were crossing the UK. They actually met Sir David and gave a nice book to him and went and had lunch with him and tea and crackers at his house in Surrey. And she somehow convinced him to do the voiceover for our little 5 or 6 minute short film.
Oh,
so that for me was everything I've done with the Kakapo program, whether it's been paid or not paid, is worth it to have made a short film narrated by Sir David.
Fantastic.
Voice is an interesting thing for a film, and it's interesting. It's a decision I've made just in the last couple of days with the film I'm working on with Brave New Wilderness, is that whole voice thing. Up until now, because we've been locked in and because I've had no budget for it, my voice has been the narration for it. And I realised today that it needed more of a
Russell Crowe.
No, but more of an indigenous voice. It needed something to tie it to the native people, and so that was my decision over the past couple of days to try and push that. And even if I have to sell another of my children, I'll see if I can pull that off.
Well, good luck with that. I hope that you get a really significant release for it, and more of the world gets to see the stories of both of these birds. Now, have you got a favourite Kakapo?
No, I don't actually. Yeah, they're all
endearing.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. That's great. Well, Scott, I usually ask all my bird people a couple of standard questions. First one is, when did you become aware that you were a bit of a bird nerd? And I think that's a valid question for you because you've kept returning to birds. So you must be a bird nerd. When did you work that out? Were you 8, 9, 7, 28, 40?
Probably about 20 seconds ago when you brought it up.
You never regarded yourself as a bird nerd?
I don't regard myself as a bird nerd. No.
Well, welcome aboard.
Thank you. Yeah. In New Zealand, you have to be. We ain't got much else. But yeah, no, I think wildlife as a whole interests me. I don't particularly lean towards one type or another. But certainly here, most of the stories that I've stumbled on or have been given to me are bird-oriented. I am a bird nerd.
Now, not realising up until now that you were a card-carrying member of the bird nerds, you probably... I'll ask you the question anyway, but I'm anticipating a bit of a blank. What's the field guide that you use when you're out being a bird?
I don't need field guides.
There we are. Well, some people could say that's because there's not enough birds in New Zealand to need one, mate.
That could be part of it, yeah.
The last question, I'm sure you can satisfy me with this one, Scott, is what's your favourite place? And I'm thinking that you might be going to tell me it's Stewart Island, but is there a favourite place you like to go out and be in the wild?
Yeah, I guess there's two ways of looking at it. My favourite Whenua would be, which is Codfish Island, where the Kakapo are, is one of my favourite spots. Whenua and Aoteoroa, which is little barrier island up in the Hauraki Gulf. So they're scientific reserves. Nobody's allowed on them. The ecosystems are incredible. There's every species you could possibly think of in these spots. So they're incredible to visit and incredible to go to, incredible to film. But at the same time, for a place that anybody can go to and the public can go to, there's a lake, there's 2 lakes across towards Tiana near Fiordland. So they're about 3 hours drive from where I am here. And they're just some native forest, bit of lake. You can camp beside the lake, you can canoe, you can kayak. There's a bit of predator work goes on around there. You've got several different species of birds, which is great. But for me, I can take the kids there. We can go and we can hang out for a week and they can enjoy the New Zealand countryside as much as anybody else there.
Now, that's just made me think of something. We've been talking about the kakapo, and you were talking about the kia and the kaka. They're the large parrots in New Zealand, but the parakeets, the kakarikis, tend to get overlooked. Is there much work that you're aware of going on with, I think it was the orange-fronted, I think was...
Up in Canterbury, there's quite a bit of work goes on with the orange-fronted especially. Yeah, you've got the yellow-fronted, the red-fronted, and the orange-fronted. The orange-fronted, I think, is the rarest. Red-fronted and yellow-fronted are generally doing reasonably well in areas that are reasonably where introduced pest species are well controlled. So even on the mainland, they don't need to necessarily be on offshore islands. There's quite a few mainland sites where the predator control is enough to keep those species numbers up. Yeah, but you're right. Yeah, there's a lot of, in many ways, the kakapo, all the attention the kakapo gets is in some ways the cost of the other species. There's lots of other species in New Zealand that are equally in danger and suffer as much as the kakapo has done in the past, but don't get anywhere near the publicity because they're not cute, cuddly green things.
I guess the main difference, I think, from an outsider point of view with the kakarikis is that there's a captive population that is fairly steady, even though they're not common birds in captivity. There's a gene pool there, so they're not quite as perilous as to being lost forever. So yeah.
And don't forget you've got your own night parrot in Australia now, haven't you?
We have now
discovered on the front of a truck.
I was brought up thinking that it's gone. We'll probably never see it again. Now it seems to be that it's always been more common than anyone knew. It's just in the places that people aren't. And certainly that people are not at night. People might be passing through, droving and whatnot historically, but the birds are there. But we've got the ground parrot here, and the western subspecies of the ground parrot is on very tenuous ground. So that's another ground-living green, mottled green bird. But yeah, we've certainly got plenty of species to worry about, but none that are quite as weird as Kakapo. I think anyone who's watched vision of them would go, is that real? Is it? Or is that animatronics?
It's bizarre. Yeah.
Well, Scott, where should people be looking eagerly towards the release of the new film? Have you got any feeling of, if you get a deal, do you think it's likely to be on a channel like Nat?
Yeah, I would hope so. So yeah, I've got Instagram, Twitter, the website, it's all there, which I try and keep as much interest going in the project as I can. I think I'll probably give it another couple of weeks, and if things are still quiet in a couple of weeks, then we might have to think of another plan that might involve some sort of crowdfunding, or we might even just put it to, I can't afford to let this one go to YouTube for nothing, so I might have to put this one onto Vimeo, and people can purchase it and watch it if they're happy to spend a little bit of cash.
Well, let us know what happens with that. Now, if anybody is listening and wants to get an update right now, elwyn.co.nz, ELWIN. That's the website where Scott's going to put everything, and I'll link the socials with the episode, Scott. And hopefully there's some news in the not too distant future about the new film. Are they likely to change the name, do you think?
Who knows? You haven't eaten for a week, you'll let people do anything.
Yeah, so I'm not really pushing a name, because who knows, when they search for it, that might not be what it's called. But elwyn.co.nz is where you can find the latest information from Scott Mouat and his escapades, adventures with which I've really enjoyed learning about. Thanks so much, Scott, for giving us your time, and please keep us updated on what you're doing next.
No worries. Thank you, Grant. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.